New York City, 1986. Inside a quiet Manhattan restaurant, Gambino figures sat across from Sicilian envoys. No notes were taken. No deals were negotiated. The decisions had already been made by someone who wasn't in the room. By the mid-1980s, John Gotti stood at the center of power in New York, visible, confident, untouchable. But real control didn't come from the streets. It came from supply, from money, from systems that began in Sicily. Salvatore Riina never needed to be present. His authority was already built in. The most powerful man in New York wasn't the one making the decisions, and the man who was never needed to show his face. Before Gotti, the system beneath the surface. New York, late 1960s. Long before John Gotti became the face of the Gambino family, the real structure of power was already in place, quiet, disciplined, and largely invisible. The American Mafia didn't operate in isolation. It was tied, both culturally and economically, to Sicily. Men moved between Palermo and New York. Messages traveled through trusted couriers. Decisions were rarely written down, but they were understood. The heroin trade made that connection unavoidable. Raw product flowed out of Sicily, refined through networks that stretched into Europe, then landed in American cities where families like the Gambinos handled distribution. This wasn't just business. It was dependency. Control over supply meant control over profit, and control over profit meant influence over strategy. Sicilian figures didn't need to sit in New York to shape what happened there. They set limits: who could move product, how much, and through which channels. Step outside those boundaries, and consequences followed, not always immediately, but always deliberately. Within the Gambino family, leadership still mattered. Bosses like Carlo Gambino maintained order, managed crews, and kept law enforcement pressure contained. But even they understood there were lines that could not be crossed. Certain decisions required quiet consultation. Certain opportunities were simply not theirs to take. By the time Gotti emerged, the structure was already decades old. He didn't build it, he inherited it. That system didn't run itself. It was shaped by a man who turned control into something far more absolute. The man who centralized fear. Salvatore Totò Riina, Corleone, Sicily, 1970s. A small inland town far from the ports and cities that defined traditional mafia power. But from here, Salvatore Totò Riina began reshaping the entire structure. Riina didn't rise through negotiation. He rose through elimination. The Corleonesi faction, once considered outsiders, began systematically targeting rival families across Sicily. Palermo, the historic center of mafia authority, became a battleground. Bosses disappeared. Alliances collapsed. By the early 1980s, what had once been a loose network of competing groups was being pulled into a single dominant force. Riina's approach was different. He didn't maintain balance. He removed it. Power became centralized. Decisions flowed through a tighter circle. Loyalty was enforced not just through tradition, but through fear. Those who resisted weren't warned twice, and those who cooperated understood the cost of hesitation. But Riina's influence didn't stop at Sicily's borders. As heroin production and distribution expanded, his control over supply gave him leverage far beyond Italy. American families, including the Gambinos, relied on that flow. Without it, entire revenue streams would collapse. Riina didn't need visibility in New York. He didn't need headlines. His authority was built into the system itself. Quiet, distant, but unavoidable. For the first time, power wasn't just shared across the Atlantic. It was directed from one side. But power alone wasn't enough. Riina needed leverage, and that leverage came from a business the Gambinos couldn't survive without. If this kind of documented truth interests you, stay with it. The pipeline. Heroin, money, and dependence. By the late 1970s, the connection between Sicily and New York had turned into a structured pipeline. Heroin didn't just appear on the streets. It followed a controlled route. Raw materials moved through the Middle East, were refined in Sicily, and then shipped into the United States, where families like the Gambinos handled distribution. But distribution was only the final step. The real control sat upstream. Whoever controlled supply, controlled price, volume, and access. American families could sell, but they couldn't produce. If shipments slowed, everything slowed. If they stopped, revenue collapsed overnight. That imbalance created dependence. that couldn't be negotiated away. Federal investigations later exposed this system in detail. The Pizza Connection trial revealed a network linking Sicilian producers to American distributors through restaurants and import businesses. It showed a pipeline moving hundreds of millions of dollars through coordinated routes between Palermo and New York. Money followed the same path in reverse. Cash generated in New York was funneled back through businesses, filtered into European channels, and absorbed into a system designed to hide its origin. This wasn't partnership. It was structure. And nowhere was that dependence more visible than under the man who tried to turn crime into a corporate empire. Castellano's illusion of control, New York, early 1980s. Paul Castellano ran the Gambino family like a business. He preferred offices over street corners, conversations over confrontations, construction companies, trucking firms, food distribution. These weren't side operations. They were the foundation of how he managed risk and built steady income. On the surface, it looked like control. But beneath that structure, the same dependency remained. High-level profits still relied on networks that didn't originate in New York. Heroin distribution, international contacts, and laundering channels were tied to relationships that extended back to Sicily. Figures like John Gambino played a key role in maintaining those connections. Operating between Italy and the United States, he became part of a network that linked Sicilian suppliers directly to American families. Investigations later showed how deeply these ties ran, with transatlantic operations moving large volumes of heroin into New York. Castellano could organize crews, manage money, and expand legitimate fronts. But he didn't control the source of one of the most profitable operations under his influence. That created limits. Decisions that appeared internal were often shaped by external realities. Expand too far, disrupt the wrong connection, and the system could push back in ways that couldn't be managed from New York. In December 1985, outside Spark Steakhouse, Castellano's control ended. But removing one leader didn't remove the structure beneath him. Gotti's rise and the ceiling above him. December 16, 1985, Manhattan. Paul Castellano steps out of a car and is shot dead in front of Spark Steakhouse. Within hours, the balance of power inside the Gambino family shifts. John Gotti takes control. Unlike Castellano, Gotti embraces visibility. Tailored suits, public appearances, confident statements outside courthouses, he becomes a symbol, not just a boss. The media gives him a name. The public starts to recognize his face. Inside the family, his rise signals a return to street authority. It looks like dominance, but control has layers. Gotti could command crews, settle disputes, and enforce discipline across New York. He could shape how the Gambino family operated day to day. What he couldn't do was rewrite the structure that fed it. The heroin pipeline still ran through Sicily. The laundering network still depended on international channels. Decisions made across the Atlantic still carried weight, whether acknowledged or not. Gotti operated at the top of the visible hierarchy, but not the entire system. That created a ceiling. Push too far, and supply could tighten. Challenge the wrong connections, and money could stop moving. Authority, in that sense, wasn't just about power. It was about understanding limits. Gotti projected control. But behind that image, there were boundaries he couldn't openly confront. Because inside the Gambino family, there was a fear no one could publicly acknowledge. The unspoken fear. Crossing Sicily. Transatlantic Mafia politics. By the mid-1980s, the Gambino family controlled territory, crews and influence across New York. On the surface, it looked complete. Orders were followed. Money moved. Disputes were settled quickly. But inside that structure, there were limits everyone understood. Even if they were never spoken out loud, certain topics were avoided in meetings. Certain opportunities, no matter how profitable, were left untouched. Not because the family lacked power, but because pushing too far meant crossing lines that extended beyond the city, beyond the country. Sicily wasn't just part of the system, it was the foundation of it. The heroin trade made that clear. Supply didn't begin in New York, and it couldn't be recreated there. The same applied to financial channels. Money didn't just get earned, it had to be moved, cleaned, and protected through networks that reached into Europe. Those networks depended on trust, and that trust had already been claimed by Sicilian leadership. If that trust broke, the consequences weren't immediate, but they were final. Shipments could slow without explanation. routes could quietly close, contacts could disappear, and once that happened, there was no direct way to repair it. Violence couldn't fix it. Influence couldn't fix it. The damage would simply remain. Even under John Gotti, this reality didn't change. He could control what happened in New York. He could command loyalty, enforce discipline, and project power in public. But there were boundaries he couldn't challenge without risking the entire structure that supported his position. That was the unspoken fear, not of a person, but of a system that couldn't be replaced. Then, thousands of miles away, that same Sicilian power made a decision that would shake the entire system. Riina's war against the state, Italy, late 1980s. For years, Salvatore had focused on consolidating power within the mafia, eliminating rivals, enforcing loyalty, and tightening control. But as pressure from Italian authorities increased, his strategy shifted. The conflict moved beyond the underworld. Investigators, judges, and prosecutors had spent years building cases against organized crime. They followed money trails, mapped networks, and slowly began exposing the structure that had operated in the shadows for decades. Riina's response was not to retreat, it was to escalate. The violence became direct and public. In May 1992, Giovanni Falcone was traveling along a highway near Capaci, Sicily, when explosives hidden beneath the road were detonated, killing him, his wife, and members of his security detail. Weeks later, in July, Paolo Borsellino was killed by a car bomb in Palermo. Both men had played central roles in prosecuting mafia leaders. Their deaths were meant to send a clear message: the state could be reached, and it could be punished. But the effect wasn't intimidation. It was escalation from the other side. The Italian government responded with unprecedented force. Specialized anti-mafia units expanded operations. Surveillance increased. Financial investigations deepened. Arrests became more frequent, and the pressure extended into areas that had once been considered secure. That pressure didn't stay contained within Italy. The same networks that supported international drug trafficking and money movement were now under strain. Communication became riskier. Delays became common. Trust began to erode under constant scrutiny. The system that connected Sicily to New York, once stable and predictable, started to weaken. And when that system began to crack, it exposed something American families could no longer ignore. They had built their operations on a structure they didn't control. The arrest that shifted power, January 15, 1993, Palermo, Sicily. After decades of violence, secrecy, and control, Salvatore Riina was taken into custody by Italian authorities. The arrest itself was quiet compared to the reputation that surrounded him. There was no public confrontation, no drawn-out standoff. It was the result of long-term investigation, surveillance, and coordination. But what it represented was far larger than the moment it happened. Riina had spent years centralizing power within the Sicilian Mafia. Decisions flowed through him. Authority was concentrated, enforced through both loyalty and fear. That structure created stability, predictable, controlled, and disciplined. When he was removed, that stability didn't transfer. It fractured. Leadership within the organization became uncertain. Different factions responded in different ways. Some sought to reduce visibility and avoid further confrontation with the state. Others struggled to maintain the aggressive posture that had defined Riina's rule. Coordination weakened. Trust, once enforced through a single authority, became more fragile. For American families, including the Gambinos, the effects were immediate, even if not always visible. The pipeline still existed, but it no longer operated with the same consistency. Shipments became less reliable. Financial channels required more caution. Decisions that had once been centralized were now dispersed, making outcomes harder to predict. It revealed a deeper truth. For years, the structure that supported American operations had been shaped elsewhere. It had provided stability, supply, and direction, but it had never been under their control. And once that structure began to change, there was no way to restore it from New York. And with that illusion broken, one question remains: who was ever truly in charge? The bottom line: who really held authority? By the early 1990s, the image of power had begun to separate from the reality behind it. In New York, names like John Gotti dominated headlines. They represented control, influence, and visibility. But the system that sustained that power had never been confined to one city or even one country. It moved through ports, banks, back channels, and alliances that stretched far beyond what the public ever saw. Authority wasn't always where it appeared to be. The Gambino family could control territory, enforce rules, and generate profit. But the deeper structure, the supply lines, the financial networks, the decisions that shaped entire markets often existed elsewhere, guided by figures who rarely stepped into the spotlight. When that structure weakened, so did the illusion of control. What remained wasn't a single hierarchy, but a network fluid, adaptable, and harder to define. Power shifted quietly, following opportunity rather than loyalty, crossing borders without recognition. So the question isn't just who led the Gambino family, it's whether men like Gotti were ever truly at the top, or simply the most visible part of something much larger. If you value real underworld history grounded in documented events, consider subscribing